Eternal Strands is the ambitious debut title from Yellow Brick Games. It has a magic system that focuses on environmental effects, which makes using spells to defeat your enemies particularly dangerous, because sometimes I was just wanting to set an enemy on fire, but instead I found myself in the middle of a sea of flames. But I guess that's what fire resistance is for. On the other hand, I loved facing off against the game's titanic bosses, using spells to restrain their limbs, climbing on the creatures, and slowly chipping away at their defenses while trying to keep them from throwing me off or catching me with one of their devastating grab moves. Early on, these fights felt oppressive, which made bringing one of these monstrosities down even more satisfying. And so for the first 10 or so hours, I thought I'd be playing the game primarily for the systems-driven combat and the boss fights. But I ended up getting dragged into the game's story instead, because there's a surprising amount of nuance and maturity in the writing, and the voice acting is absolutely excellent. So, before I get into the rest of my thoughts for the game, a quick reminder. If you like seeing reviews, you want to know more about games, maybe you're interested in the occasional guide, tier list, etc., be sure to get subscribed, leave a like while you're down there, and for now, let's get into things. So first up, the game's opening cutscene reminded me a lot of the hand-drawn animation used for many JRPGs in the GameCube era. Now, I suspect part of the reason for this is it's pretty difficult to pull off good performance capture, or at the very least expensive. But I also found this creative choice to be charming. It does a great job of introducing the various members of the Weaver Band, while helping the game stand apart from so many of its peers, which did go for the performance capture or in-game rendered CGI cutscene. Overall, these cutscenes of the game are kind of a rarity. They only show up for a few major plot points. But when they did show up, I always found them to be welcome. Now, right after this cutscene, Bryn has a short conversation with Aurea before departing on her first mission. And I'm just going to play a short clip from it.
I know the scry is a standard device across Weaver bands, but my previous leader, Aaron, didn't really make use of ours.
He sent you on expeditions without it?
I mean, I wore the earpiece, but he didn't exactly stay close to the table at the camp while I was out.
That's incredibly dangerous. I'm surprised you're still alive.
Yeah. Anyway, mind explaining how it works in your Weaver band?
When you go on an expedition, you'll wear the earpiece, which allows me to communicate with you and give directions from the scry table. At the table, everyone will be able to watch your expedition and communicate with you as needed. The last, most important function of the scry is that it allows me to use magic to pull you back to camp when your life is in danger.
Right.
I really appreciate the narrative framing here, because me, the player, has no idea what a scry is or how it works, but Bryn lives in this world. She's been part of a Weaver's band before. She should know how a scry works. So why would Aurea be explaining it to her? Well, the game frames it as her previous Weaver band was incompetent, therefore she didn't know how this crucial tool worked. And I love when games ground their explanations within the world. Sure, the game could pause, there could be a menu just taking you out of the whole experience. But doing it this way is not only immersive, but it doesn't seem like it's too, well, video gamey. Unfortunately, after this, you begin the game's tutorial. I found following the tutorial to be really boring, it took way too long, and there were no real stakes, because while there is the threat of the Ash Peak Drake throughout the tutorial, it is very rare that the tutorial puts you in any actual danger. There are a couple points where you can fall off a cliff, where you can die to an enemy, but it's probably not going to happen. And so when I got to the end, I was kind of bored. I thought, finally, I can confront the Ash Peak Drake. Nope. It ends in a cutscene. Admittedly, a really good cutscene. The narrative stakes here and the tension felt far better than during the tutorial where I could actually play the game. This is how you make it into the Enclave, how you get past all of the deadly tangles, where you get to start gathering materials and fighting the epic monsters. I guess that there has to be some sort of tutorial to tell people the controls and introduce new players to the game, but I wish it was either shorter or at the very least skippable so I could have enjoyed the two cutscenes and then jumped straight into the action. I was heavily invested in the story for Eternal Strands, but it didn't start out that way. It actually took some time for the characters to grow on me. And this makes sense. Brynn knows her companions. She's been traveling with them for a while, but me as a player, well, I just got here. I don't know who any of these people are or why I should care about them. But as I saw Brynn interact with the different companions, and each time I went back to camp to experience a bit more of a story, I grew a little bit more interested. Because most of the early gameplay consists of either going out and adventuring in the Enclave, fighting monsters, taking down bosses, and gathering materials, or coming back to base and talking with various members of the Weaver Band. By the game's midpoint, things change a bit once you reach Cassidon's Hold. And here's where the story really started to grab me, because Cassidon's Hold introduces several new characters, each of which play off of a Weaver Band in new and interesting ways. In particular, I was impressed with the Eye, the antagonist who gets introduced in Cassidon's Hold, though of course in his mind he's the hero of the story. What really impressed me is the way he's written, because he is very easy to hate. He's not a good dude, and he's absolutely manipulating everyone around him. But at the same time, part of the reason he's doing this is because he's constantly being ruled by his own insecurities. In short, the reason he acts like he's better than everyone else is because deep down, he knows he never will be. And that's exactly the sort of writing I want from my villains in a game. It's exactly the reason why I play story-based RPGs. Plus, you get to see each member of a Weaver Band deal with this in different ways. Some of them shut down. Some of them try to reason with him. And others, like Brynn, have a chance to stand defiant, defying the Eye while proving she is the hero that he wished he could be. And so before I knew it, I was rushing through the zones in hopes of getting the next story segment, while also progressing all of my companion quests, because each member of a Weaver Band has a companion quest, and they are widely varied. These were far more than simple fetch quests or building up relationship points. In fact, they got into a lot of pretty heavy topics like mental illness, or what happens when you and your partner share different goals in life, or how to handle someone betraying you. They did so in both a mature and a nuanced way. Now, in general, I do prefer stories where the player has an impact, where you make choices and those choices matter. Something like Witcher 3. But when a linear narrative is well written and has good voice acting, I'm also happy to be along for the ride. And so, if you like story-based games, personally I would say that Eternal Strands is worth playing for the story alone. But there is more to Eternal Strands than just the story. Brynn is the group's point. That means she has to set out and explore different areas of the Enclave to gather materials, fight enemies, and of course, help them solve all the mysteries. In other words, this is where I'm going to start talking about the gameplay. And the first thing that stood out to me is large portions of the environment are breakable. You can't tunnel into the ground or shatter a cliff face, but most smaller objects are fully destructible. And if you have a powerful enough spell, you can absolutely use telekinesis to hurl a boulder, a tree, or maybe even a whole cart at that enemy. Not only this, but if that cart or the enemy happens to shatter from the impact, you might gain some useful materials like wood or stone. In addition, areas can be affected by different environmental weather effects. One time when you visit, everything might be a frozen wasteland. The next, it'll be blanketed in a scorching haze. And then after that, it's covered in a miasma of raw magic. Not only does this affect the zone's inhabitants, somewhat changing which monsters appear, but you might want some extra resistances if you're going into a cold biome, a hot biome, and if you're going into raw magic, you better just be really careful. But as you're doing all this, you're going to be gathering materials, and initially I found the resource gathering to be frustrating. Inventory space was extremely limited, and I found myself constantly cutting trips short to go back to base, or throwing away materials that I wanted because I was worried that I would run out of time. Spoiler alert, you won't run out of time. You can go through as many in-game days as you want, and there are no consequences. But shortly after release, the developers dropped a patch that increased inventory space. This, combined with upgrading Casman Station to also increase inventory space a couple times, and I had plenty of space to bring back anything that I actually cared about. Now, while exploring a zone for the first time, there's a great feeling of discovery. You could climb on pretty much anything. If there's a rock, you can hit it, and maybe it'll drop something interesting, maybe it won't. Or maybe you can use that rock to defeat an enemy. If there's a gap you can't jump across, well, just summon an ice bridge. If there's ice blocking your path, use fire to melt it. very rarely does the game put up any barriers, minus reaching the hard edge of a zone, to stop you from your exploration. Unfortunately, the game doesn't have that many zones. There's only 7 of them, and like half of them look like other zones. So ultimately, it did start to feel very repetitive. This wasn't really helped by the fact that there's only like a dozen or so different enemies, so it felt like I was constantly gathering different materials by fighting the same enemies in a similar looking environment. But that isn't to say there aren't some really cool moments, especially when it comes to blending the environment with the elemental combat system. My favorite moment was the realization that my elemental spells could affect materials as well, because one of the combat mechanics, don't worry, getting to that soon, is tempering enemies. In other words, freezing them or superheating them to change the materials they drop. So I thought, okay, well, what about ore? I get materials from that. And sure enough, yes, if you freeze an ore, it only drops the rare materials, just like if you froze an enemy to temper it. And yes, superheating it tempers the ore, giving you refined materials. This is absolutely awesome. Very much my favorite point of the gathering and crafting system, and something that I would love for more games with systems like this to do. But okay, I've put off talking about this for long enough. What about the combat? Against normal enemies, combat is not great. Melee feels both clunky due to the stamina, and also kind of floaty as your blows just don't really have weight. Enemies don't react to them all that much unless you use a heavy attack, and if you use a heavy attack, you can kind of just perma-stun them. And so, in a lot of ways, it felt like the worst of both worlds. I did try all the weapons, the sword and shield, the bow, but most of my time was spent on the claymore, because I found I could use magic to crowd control or otherwise deal with groups of enemies, and then against a single foe, all I had to do was heavy attack, spam attack, and I could stun lock the enemy and dispatch it without an issue. In the early game, your attacks are actually quite weak, and this encourages you to use magic to dispatch foes. To be clear, there are a lot of cool things you can do with magic, such as using a gravity well to lock an enemy in place, and if you do this on an archer, their arrow will actually get caught in the gravity well and shoot them, which is awesome. Or you could ignite or freeze the gravity well, creating an elemental explosion. Also, one of my favorite things to do, when I faced a tanky foe wielding a shield, well, I could use telekinesis to grab that shield and then beat them to death with it. I believe this requires rank 2 telekinesis. But unfortunately, the enemies are kind of spongy, which made them more tedious than fun to defeat. After all, once you lock a regular enemy in a gravity well, or in case of an ice, there's nothing they can do. They are just a health bar at that point, and you can take your time in depleting it. And since it's so easy to render normal enemies non-threats, the only real reason to fight them is for the materials they drop. And since you get so many materials from just opening treasure chests around the zone, I found that very quickly when I didn't need the materials from a specific enemy, instead of trying to fight them, I would simply run past or use telekinesis to hurl them off a cliff so they're a problem for someone else. By someone else, I mean me 5 minutes later when I reach the bottom of the cliff. Where the combat system actually felt really good was in the battles against the epic boss monsters. Now, battles against epic boss monsters are hard. This is my least favorite part of almost every Souls-like game, because in almost every Souls-like game, it feels like you are fighting against the camera, not the enemy. But in Eternal Strands, you don't have to worry about that, because you are not just standing there chopping at a thing's ankles. In fact, it is far too large and well armored to go down from just a couple of sword swings to its ankles. So what you have to do is climb on them and chop away at the exposed bits. But these titans are not going to sit idly by, they're going to attempt to crush you beneath your feet. So maybe you can use some ice to freeze those feet to the ground, giving you an opening. Or, if a monster's breathing fire, you can counter it with a stream of ice. If it shoots a fireball at you, you can catch it and label that Return to Sender for a nice burst of damage. All of the elemental effects come together, resulting in epic clashes. But your stamina also functions totally differently in these fights. It is no longer the I can attack a few times button. Now it's a primary resource you use to climb on enemies. When they try to throw you off, you need to cling on to avoid losing stamina. Alternatively, if a monster is trying to grab you, well, number one, you can avoid this by standing in a spot it physically can't reach. Its arm's not just going to clip through its chest and grab you, as horrifying as that would be. So, look for the hand it's using to hold its weapon. Sit on the other arm. Well, It only has one arm, and yes, it can swap hands with its weapon. That's going to take it time, and you'll get a fair few chops in while it does. Or you could jump out of the way, but this will cost you some extra stamina. Remember, while doing all of this, not only can you hack away chunks of a monster, you can even sometimes break its limbs, or if you're fighting an arc, look for weak points that you can use to shatter the armor, exposing soft flesh beneath, which is a perfect opportunity to deal damage. Now later on, if I just wanted to kill an enemy, I found spells like the Molten Barrage to be incredibly effective. Yeah, summoning a few mini volcanoes? Pretty good spell. Summoning mini volcanoes directly on a monster's exposed flesh? Awesome spell. 10 out of 10. Recommend. But more often than not, I didn't want to kill these titans directly. Instead, I wanted to harvest them and use the strand gained to upgrade one of my spells. In this way, each monster is a puzzle that you need to solve. If you can do that, you're able to not only kill it instantly, but gain a strand which is a permanent upgrade. So to give you a better idea of the epic battles awaiting you in Eternal Strands, here's my battle against the game's first boss, the Ark of the Stricken Earth, where I also successfully harvest it. And by the way, if you're struggling to figure out exactly what you need to do to harvest an enemy, you can always check in with Lane to compile the monster's codex entry. Occasionally, as you're exploring the various zones of the Enclave, you'll come across an equipment pattern. If you take this to the Weaver Band's blacksmith Sola, you can experience the game's unique crafting system. So here, we have Sola's Forge, where you can craft, reforge, upgrade, and dismantle equipment. First up, crafting. This is how you use all of those blueprints you find. Let's just use this kinetic sword and shield as an example. It requires 6 hand resources, 3 forged resources, 2 carved resources, and 1 woven resource. What the heck is that? Well, in most games, this would say something like requires fine leather, steel, softwood, and bandit's pocket thread. Instead, in Eternal Strands, you get all sorts of resources that fit into broad categories, and you can use any of them. Well, in Eternal Strand, the resources have all sorts of different stats, and instead of a recipe requiring a specific thing, instead it just requires a broad category, like a leather item or a tanned resource. So, for example, this kinetic sword and shield could be made with hard leather, which would increase the damage by 6 over the base, increase the heat resistance and the cold resistance by 3 each. You can also use higher tier materials, such as this wonderful Frostbane leather. This is a cold resource, so it massively boosts the cold resistance, while also decreasing the heat resistance, making you more vulnerable to fire. And since it's tier 4, instead of the hard leather's tier 2, you're also going to be getting a lot more base stats and even lower weight. So just for the sake of demonstration, let's say insulated leather. Next up, the forged resource. And in this case, you have the cold resist, the balanced, which gives a little bit of everything, the fire resist, and the protective, which gives less resistances, but more overall damage, at least if we're talking about weapons. More armor if we're talking about, well, armor. And for this example, let's just use some refined serenite. Then a carved resource, sure, why not? Elder Husk, tier 5, the top shelf stuff. And for the woven resource, some nice cinder-infused linen. Also, the astute among you may notice, the item changes in small, subtle ways as you adjust the materials. So with the Elder Husk, the wooden part of a shield is white. If you turn it to Drake scale, it now turns brown, or maybe an umber, representing the Drake scale. Then you just hit craft. You can equip your new item, or you can do some fun stuff with it. For example, let's say you made it, and you take it out and you realize, I have a problem. Fire damage is a thing, and I don't have enough defense against it. So, to get more fire resistance, you simply switch out the insulated leather, which again gives cold resist and lowers fire res, for something like double bend leather, which is balanced. Or maybe you want way more fire res, so you go with aniline leather. This boosts fire resistance at the cost of cold resistance. And you can reforge your gear at any time, plus you get the old materials back. So if you want to experiment, or if you just want to swap your loadout based on what you're doing at the time, this is a really easy way to do it. After that, there's upgrade. Upgrade depends on the level of the forge, with each level adding an additional upgrade. It also consumes some of the materials, so you don't always want to use your best materials, as you may not be able to upgrade the resulting item. Each time you upgrade it, some of the stats are boosted. With the exact boosts, well, of course, depending on the materials used. And so, once you've fully upgraded it, your item now has significantly better stats. Last but not least, dismantle. This destroys the item and gives you, yes, all the materials back, so you can go ahead and do it again next time. As you progress through the game, you'll get a variety of blueprints, with a couple of them coming from quests. In general, you can mix and match to your heart's content, though certain sets do give different bonuses. The Trapper set, for example, gives weight reduction. The Nameless Host set increases your stamina. The Opportunist set increases your magic. The Wind's Call set, which I happen to wear a lot, increases magic regeneration, so on and so forth. Plus, since you get all the materials back whenever you reforge or dismantle your equipment, feel free to experiment to your heart's content. Worst case, you can always just melt it down and try again with a different loadout. Now, in theory, this crafting system is really, really cool. But in practice, the best way I describe it is untapped or unrealized potential. First up, the game doesn't have very many stats. And second of all, because higher tier materials are always better than lower tier ones, you don't get that much room to mix and match. Your options are maximize defense, go for cold res, go for fire res, or mix and match between them / use a balanced setup. Which sure, it's still more than just having items with fixed stats, But realistically, you could have just had items with fixed stats, and it wouldn't have made that much practical difference in terms of gameplay. I really like the concept of this system. I think the idea of being able to swap out materials on your weapons and armor to customize it to your needs is awesome. It's just that the game has to have the stats to support it, and Eternal Strands really doesn't. Luckily, this is one of those systems where, while it could be a lot better, it's certainly not bad. It is nice to be able to grab that little bit of fire resistance when going into combat against an Ash Peak Drake, or grabbing some cold res when going into a frozen zone. But there are a few other things that you can do around camp, so let's go over them quickly. First up, at Dom's LTA, you can weave strands, upgrading all of your powers. You need to get these strands, again, by harvesting a powerful boss monster, and each time you upgrade a power, not only does it give you some additional bonuses, but usually any sort of offensive capabilities do get better as well. And over here, we have Lane's Archive and Apothecary. As you upgrade the Apothecary, Lane will passively craft you potions, but you can also speak to Lane directly to compile codexes. This is where you learn how all of the things work. But twice now, I've mentioned upgrading stuff. How does that work? Well, you do that over at Casman's Caravan, where you salvage your resources, effectively sacrificing them, and turning them into camp supplies. Then you spend those camp supplies to upgrade the various stations. Different stations have different levels, and for example, fully upgrading Lane's Archive means you get additional potions each time you set out. Oh, and when you fully upgrade the caravan, you can also trade directly for resources, which means if you did want to make the perfect item and you just happen to need a bunch of Elder Husk but couldn't find it, well, it's going to cost you 40 camp supplies each, but you'll be able to get as much as you ever wanted. So what's the verdict? Well, when it came to exploration and gathering, I like the freedom to pretty much climb on anything, and going into a zone for the first time did feel really good. While inventory was a bit oppressive when I first started playing, after the patch, that also felt pretty good. I didn't really feel like I was scrounging for materials constantly, and so I'd say the game's different zones, exploration, and your ability to interact with them via magic was overall pretty good and enjoyable. On the other hand, I really didn't enjoy combat, especially against normal enemies, to the point where I was actively avoiding it late game unless I felt like I really had to. On top of that, there's only a dozen or so different enemies, and it got repetitive very quickly, especially because they were so spongy. I think this would have worked better if your spells were powerful enough to take enemies out almost instantly, or if you didn't have a stamina system and could kind of just mash attacks and overwhelm them, instead of, oh, I'm just gonna sit here while the enemy's frozen in an ice block and wait for all my stamina to recover. I can't do anything, he can't do anything, we're just gonna chill for a bit. In fact, it feels like the combat system was primarily made so that Bryn could confront the massive bosses. And again, this is where combat is at its best and where it feels actually good. You need to understand the monster's moveset, what hand is currently able to grab you, and which one might be holding a weapon. Or, if it's a flying creature, can you break a wing to stop it from flying? If it uses a tail attack, can you break its tail to stop it from doing that? Is there a weird glowy bit that you should probably break because it's a weird glowy bit? All of these little puzzle aspects were super interesting and made each of the game's 9 boss encounters very engaging, with the final one being a little bit frustrating, but that was also kind of a point. It was super difficult, and while yes, the challenge did frustrate me at times, it was also very satisfying to overcome that experience. When it comes to the storytelling and the voice acting, top marks. This is an excellent narrative-driven game, and honestly, I recommend it for the story alone. If you don't like the combat, you just want to put the game on easy mode and kind of run past most of the enemies, I don't blame you one bit. And I especially like the way that the game presented serious problems while taking them seriously. It didn't laugh them off or shy away. And I suspect the voice actor for Kenrick Stenold, VI, had way too much fun playing his character. Because man, VI is an asshole, but also, damn is he well written. But in short, the storytelling's excellent, and I suggest you go out of your way to do all of the side quests. And then we have the crafting, which is a really cool concept, but kind of full of untapped potential, because I really like the idea of combining different materials to add inherent properties to your item. But in practice, the game has very few stats. You've got defense, cold res, heat res, wait, 4 stats? I mean, I guess damage instead of defense on some items? But because of that, there aren't very many levers, so you can build an item with lots of cold res and basically be immune to cold. You can build an item with lots of fire res and just sit in Dragon's Breath. Or you can build an item with high defense. Maybe you don't want to have to worry about constantly changing up your gear, which, to be honest, I didn't, so you go with a balanced approach, and that's kind of it. The system is good, it works, but I would absolutely love to see something like this in a game that has maybe 10 or 15 stats where you actually start making trade-offs rather than just, is it going to have more cold res or is it going to have more fire res? And so with all that said, what's the verdict? The game does a lot of things, and to be clear, not all of them land. The combat in particular felt like it was a miss. But the parts of it does land, like the story and the boss fights, oh boy, do those hit. I think the game's worth playing for either of those elements individually, never mind both of them combined. Throughout the game, you explore quite a bit of the Enclave, and it is good that the game doesn't make you feel like there are limits placed on your exploration. But the post-credit section makes me think this game's actually setting up for something bigger. I certainly hope they bring Austin Wintory back to do the soundtrack, because throughout my playtime, the soundtrack's been a nice subtle companion. In fact, if you've been paying attention during this review, yes, you have been hearing it in the background. So if you like action combat games or games with good stories, I definitely recommend Eternal Strands, and I very much look forward to seeing what Yellow Brick Games does in the future. We're off to a great start, and hopefully they only go up from here. Now, based on the Steam reviews, I'd definitely call Eternal Strands an underrated title. It's kinda hard to tell exactly how many people have played it since the game did also release over on Game Pass, but it wouldn't surprise me if, over the years, the game kinda grows a cult following and people look back and go, oh yeah, Eternal Strands, that hidden indie gem. Don't get me wrong, it's far from perfect. But it also offers some really interesting experiences. And I found that these are the sorts of games that do tend to hold up over time. Or at the very least, the sort of game where a bunch of people say, hey, that's a cool idea, and then immediately try to copy it. So maybe in a few years we'll be talking about Strand-likes, except we already have Strand-likes, just not this kind of Strand-like. But anyway, this was a fun one to review. I know I'm a little bit late after release, but hey, it was fun to review and reminded me that I need to play more narrative games. So maybe look out for some more of those in the future. With that said, if you're looking for something else to watch, maybe check out the recent review I did for Moonstone Island, a cozy game that kind of reminded me of Harvest Moon Rune Factory. Link to that'll be up in the card and down below. Oh, and don't forget to leave a like while you're down there. For now, thank you very much for watching to the end. I'm glad you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.